Hi, everyone, and welcome to Tell Me About Podcast, where each week two nerdy friends deep dive random topics. I'm Laura.
And I'm Tom.
And this is episode number 27.
And Laura, I want to start this week first with a thank you and also with a candid admission of truth.
Okay.
First of all, as always, we thank you for listening every single week. We love you, we appreciate you, and we are very, very humbled and very gracious that you have embraced us and accepted us into your podcast family. We appreciate you very much for that. And I do feel like, Laura, you and I try to be honest with our listeners as much as possible. So I do have to make this very, very clear. Despite all evidence to the contrary, I, Tom, your faithful co-host, did not steal the 18,000 Jaromir Jagr bobbleheads. It was not an Ocean's 11 heist situation. It wasn't even a Thomas Crown Affair heist situation. There was no heist. I am not part of the heist. And that is my only public comment on the matter.
Are you sure it wasn't you?
I am 99.9% positive it was not me. Which, by the way, I told you, when we're recording this on Friday night, this happened yesterday. This consumed my entire morning. I already have the fan fiction of Sudden Death 2, where Jean-Claude Van Damme has to now go on a search for the missing bobbleheads. I've already thought this through in my head. I did this instead of working on Thursday.
Well, I'm sure that's what they paid you for, so.
And by the way, so I'm referencing, and this is going to be a week old when you listen to this, but I don't care. It was funny. The Pittsburgh Penguins put out a tweet on Thursday morning, March 14th. They were supposed to give away 18,000 bobbleheads at their game for one of their ex-players, and they put out a tweet saying that the bobbleheads were gone. They were stolen. Literally, they were stolen. And social media, the people I follow, had a field day with this. You know, who doesn't love a good heist story? Listen, we've all watched Ocean's 11. It's fun. Allegedly.
I do like that movie.
Heist movies are fun. And the team itself, they even had a little bit of fun with it. You know, they actually put out a couple of tweets afterwards, again, kind of poking fun, enough so that people actually wondered whether it was a just elaborate bit or not, which it is not. The bobbleheads were actually stolen, I guess, in California somewhere. It was one of those things. It's not funny, but it's funny. One of the more absurd and also infamous thefts, I guess, in North American history. This is the Great Maple Syrup Heist. And if that is not an incredulous title, the literal name of it is the Great Canadian Maple Syrup Heist. So our story begins basically years in the past. To understand this whole dynamic, you have to understand how maple syrup is really controlled. This all seems so absurd. I can't even get through this already. This all seems so absurd. We're talking about maple syrup like it's water.
Well, it certainly sounds more precious than water.
At $1,800 a barrel, I would say so.
That's a lot.
You know, that's like infinitely higher than like the price of oil.
That's crazy.
I mean, that's absurd. So most of the maple syrup is produced in the province of Quebec, and it's produced literally in the woods. And if you've never seen actually how they get the maple syrup, it's very interesting. Have you ever seen that before, Laura?
No, I actually couldn't tell you how maple syrup is made.
So basically, what they do is it's a forest of maple trees. It's literally called the sugar bush. And there's pressurized lines that tap into the trees. And literally, there's like a faucet with a bucket underneath it. And they pressurize the lines, and it literally sucks the sap out and collects into these buckets. Literally, it's like a faucet. You're literally tapping into the tree to get the sap. It's exactly what it sounds like.
That visual, though, it sounds so cartoony, you know?
It sounds very cartoony, but that's what it is. It's exactly what it is. And then it basically goes into, it gets boiled, and where it basically is liquefied, and then it gets stored. So it's a whole incredible process.
Are there only maple trees in Canada? Like, nowhere else in the world can do this?
It's not that they're in Canada. It's just that Canada produces, I think it's like 94 or 95% of the maple syrup. And of that 95%, 80% of that is from Quebec.
Okay.
So basically, it's this one province that literally has a stranglehold on maple syrup production.
It sounds like they got a monopoly, yeah.
A syrupopoly.
Jesus, you had that one in your back pocket.
Yeah, I did. And so as this business is growing, normally, or I should say, back in the day, the producers, these are the people that are actually going out, tapping the trees and making the syrup. They could sell to whomever they wanted, but the prices were outrageous, allegedly, as the story goes. And so you had these farmers in Quebec who form essentially an alliance to try and keep maple syrup prices down, or try to stabilize maple syrup prices. And it's called the Federation of Quebec Maple Syrup Producers. So they come into power and they basically monopolize maple syrup production in Quebec. They institute a quota, literally a quota, on how much a producer can in a given harvest year, which, by the way, a harvest year is only from February to April, because it's in that time where it's cold enough but also warm enough that the sap is literally liquid enough to be tapped out of the trees.
That's crazy. So they literally have 2 months to do this.
They have 2 months to suck these trees dry. I'll send you a picture of how they do this. It literally looks like a roped off crime scene. It's tubes and things wrapped around, going all around trees.
I gotta see this.
And that's a smaller version, but you think of it as these. I mean, these lines they're pressurized like the same way like a beer tap would be. There should be the picture of the two lines going into the bucket.
Oh, yeah. Can I just say it doesn't look super professional. I don't know.
Especially in Quebec, a lot of these farmers are just like, they're not farmers in the way you would think, like a cattle farmer or like a corn farm, like you would think here. I mean, a lot of these are just regular people who just have trees in their backyard.
So there are people that actually, these trees are on their property and they siphon the maple syrup from their own trees. Okay.
They siphon the sap and then they boil it down to make the syrup. Under the law in Quebec, they then have to relinquish the syrup to the Federation. The Federation catalogs it. They put it in specific baby blue and white barrels. It's numbered, and it's taken to various warehouses around the province that are literally part of, and I kid you not, this is the actual term for it, the strategic reserve.
So is there like Federation police that are in charge of this?
Allegedly, yes.
Oh, God. For maple syrup. It sounds so ridiculous.
It's extremely ridiculous.
It's not drugs. It's not firearms. It's not diamonds. It's maple syrup.
I'm going to get to it, but the Netflix documentary that I watched, they literally called Quebec the Saudi Arabia of maple syrup, and the Federation isn't OPEC.
I'm starting to understand why.
So basically how the quota works is they set the production limit, and then anything above that, you're not allowed to do anything with. If it's a high production year, you can only produce up to a certain amount, and then the rest has to go be taken by the Federation to go to this reserve. And this reserve is not like a central location. They literally rent warehouses all over the province, and they keep these barrels in there.
I have 2 questions.
Yes.
So the first one, how do they predict if it's going to be like a high production season, or do they don't know? They just don't know. And what
it depends on what comes out of the trees. The same like with a crop. If it's a good harvest year, then the excess goes into the reserve. If it's a bad harvest year, then they dip into the reserve, and that gets sold by the Federation. The Federation takes a big cut of the sell, and then it gets distributed all over the world, mostly to either the U.S. or Asia, or Japan, actually. Those are the 2 biggest importers of maple syrup.
So my second question, so these people are allowed to keep some of it for themselves on high production years. Are they able to sell it, or they have to use it for personal use?
Basically, any sales in Quebec, if you have maple syrup in Quebec, technically the maple syrup, even if you produce it, even if it's on your property, is not yours. It belongs to the Federation. And so everything you do with the maple syrup must be done through the
How much do they get to keep on a high production year?
I think they get like 20 or 30% of the profit.
No, I meant like volume.
It depends every year. It depends on what comes in and out. So the number changes every year.
Okay.
Yeah, basically everything they do has to go with the syrup, has to go through the Federation in Quebec, where basically it is literally illegal to do anything with the syrup in Quebec in the province and not go through the Federation. It's against the law. So what happens is over the last 20, 25 years, there's been a maple syrup resistance.
People who don't want to abide by these rules.
I mean, literally, yes. There's been a divide of, this sounds like Star Wars, a divide of pro and anti-Federation farmers, and there's basically become a maple syrup black market where syrup is smuggled essentially out of the province to a place like New Brunswick where it's not illegal to sell it, and then it's sold. They're selling it to legitimate buyers, and the buyers have no idea whether or not the syrup is quote-unquote black market maple syrup or not. They have clean hands in this, the buyers. It's more, they're not allowed to, basically, if it's in Quebec, other provinces, you're allowed to sell it, but you can't sell it if it came from Quebec. Again, everything has to go through the federal, and so you have this extremely deep divide between people who feel like the Federation is necessary to stabilize prices and that you cannot have a free market, and basically it allows everyone to profit, and people that think this is an invasion of personal freedom.
I mean, I'm definitely on the side of, yeah, this is an invasion of personal freedom. Like it sounds very authoritarian.
Yeah, the Federation's been described as a mafia, a Gestapo, a cartel. Again, we're talking about maple syrup.
Can I ask what the penalty is if you break this law in Quebec?
At least $1 million in fines.
$1 million.
The other thing too is that all these farms are inspected yearly by the Federation. And they can come and they can surveil you, and they can basically take secret pictures of your house. They have this power to find out what you've been doing with the maple syrup. And they interviewed a lady who basically started selling it on the black market to a buyer in New Brunswick, and she was fined, I believe it was either $900 or $1 million Canadian, and the fine was upheld by the Supreme Court.
Well, that kind of led into what I was thinking. The Canadian Parliament can't or won't do anything about this?
So the line is, especially from anti-Federation, is that the Federation is extremely powerful, and they've bought influence in Ottawa among members of Parliament and politicians. Quebec politics is extremely complicated, to say the least, in that you have large portions of the province are rural, and they are very, very protective of the French culture, and basically see anything, and even any acquiescence to English as the Queen is invading and trying to anglicize the province. And so a lot of ruling party was either the old Bloc Québécois or now the Parti Québécois, the PQ, who have basically made multiple attempts to try and separate from the country. And they keep failing because while that is a very popular issue in a lot of Quebec, which is rural, it's not where the people are. The people are in Montreal, and the people are in Hull, which is literally right across the river from Ottawa and is a suburb. And so the population centers constantly voted down, which, again, I can do another podcast about the fact that the last time they tried this in 2017, the party accused Ontario of busing people into Hull to vote against separation. I mean, it's American politics on a micro scale.
That's what I was going to say. That's exactly what it sounds like.
And it's a little bit different because, to the best of my understanding with Canadian politics, you're not necessarily voting for a politician. You're voting for a party. When you vote for like a member of parliament and then whatever the representative is of the party, whatever party gets the most votes, they win the seat. So that's how they elect a prime minister. It's whatever party has the most seats in parliament. And then whoever the leader is the prime minister. This has been Canadian civic history with Tom. But anyway, back to the story. It's under all of this, and it's under this. Quebec gets extremely agitated when the West or the Maritimes, basically anything that's Anglo, a lot of things they do is very much contained inside Quebec. And that includes, again, maple syrup production. So in 2010, the Federation has a surplus of syrup. And they have so much that they're looking for an extra warehouse to store it. So they reach out to a gentleman named Avik Karan. Now, Karan has a rap sheet. And one of the things they actually did too in the documentary is they interviewed a 60 Minutes investigative journalist who literally chased people down to talk about maple syrup heists. So he comes into this with a previous criminal history of fraud. He was sent to jail for fraud. So his wife buys a warehouse in St. Louis de Blanford, which is in the rural part of Quebec. So he has inside information. Now, as the story goes, he had no ties to the syrup community before this. But he realizes very quickly that this is worth $1,800 a barrel. He also realizes that the Federation only inspects their warehouses once a year. And so he devises a plan. He eventually comes into contact with two gentlemen called, one is called Richard Valliere, and another is Sebastien Dutra. Valliere had a long history of being a maple syrup smuggler. Basically, what would happen is he would get the syrup that was smuggled, and then he would transfer it to another party. I mean, it's almost like syrup laundering. Essentially, he would get the syrup, he would go to someone else, and then from there it would be sold and distributed.
That's exactly what it is. That's crazy.
Yeah. We're gonna have a raid on an IHOP.
Unbelievable.
So Dutra is a truck driver, and as the story goes, Valliere and Dutra come in contact with Karan, and they hatch this plan. Basically, the plan is they're going to take a couple of barrels a day from the warehouse, take them to the woods, literally drain the barrel of syrup, siphon the syrup out of the barrels so that there wouldn't be any evidence that the barrels were tampered with, refill them with water, and then return them to the warehouse. With other barrels, they took the barrels, emptied them, and replaced them with complete decoys. They took different barrels, painted them the same exact color, forged the Federation label with the sticker, and put the empty barrel back. This is very intricate.
It is. I was gonna say this is pretty detailed.
And by the way, they're communicating all this with each other on burner phones.
Of course they are.
I remember we talked about with the Alcatraz episode, right? We talked about how kind of intricate and how thought out this plan was. This is kind of the same thing. Like, what they're doing is they rented a forklift to get the barrels out. They either empty the barrels and refill them with water, or they just take the barrel and replace it with a decoy that had been painted the same exact color, the same exact shade of blue, with a fake label that looked exactly the same. Meanwhile, all the while, they're then covering up the Federation barrel with a different label so that it can then be passed on. Again, this is extremely intricate.
I wonder how long it took them to come up with this and put this together.
Well, the actual heist took over a year.
Okay.
They even went so far as to rent a very specific forklift that the Federation uses because it's the only forklift that doesn't scar the barrel. Literally doesn't leave a black mark on the barrel. By the time it's all done in 2011 and 2012, they steal 9,500 barrels of syrup.
That's a lot of syrup.
That's a shitload of syrup. That equals out to about $18 million Canadian. It's not discovered, though, until August of 2012. So Michael Gavreau is the inspector who was going around in July and August of 2012 and was going to all the different warehouses that made up this strategic reserve. And the other thing, too, you have to remember is that when they say warehouses, because they call this supposedly the Fort Knox of Canada, these are not warehouses that are behind chain link fence, that have a ton of security, that are in a centralized location. They're literally just warehouses all over Quebec. You wouldn't even know it unless you went inside.
So there's nothing at all from the outside that's identifiable that this is a warehouse, a Federation warehouse?
Nope. Because a lot of times they're sharing space with other things that they keep in the warehouse. So in July and August of 2012, they're doing the yearly inspections. And at this specific warehouse that Caron's wife owned, the inspector is climbing up the wall of barrels to get to the top. As he's climbing up the wall of barrels, as he goes to climb, because these are 600-pound barrels of syrup, he goes to use one as a handhold, and he falls off the wall.
Whoops.
And he fell off the wall because he had tried to climb one of the empty barrels. And that's how it was found out.
Yeah, when you were saying how they were replacing some of them with water and some of them were empty, I immediately thought about the weight of it and how that might affect that in the long run. Water is probably somewhat around the same weight, I would guess, or at least closer than nothing. I felt like, yeah, that was...
Well, I mean, listen, you're going to cut corners somewhere.
Well, if you're doing something illegal, then optimally you're not cutting any corners because you don't want to get caught.
I mean, yes, ideally, but when maple syrup's involved, it all goes out the window. I could also tell you that this plan was hatched at a truck stop with dinosaur statues in it.
Dinosaur statues?
There's a truck stop in Quebec where the plan was supposedly hatched between the three men. That is literally just outside. It's a McDonald's, it's an Esso station, and then there's just a giant Stegosaurus and a giant T-Rex outside.
A bit random, but okay.
Quebec is a weird and wild and wonderful place. Again, so it's 2012. that's when it's discovered. The provincial police are called in, and they do a full CSI investigation of the warehouse.
They coming in with like blacklight looking for fingerprints and like shit that.
There were diagrams, there were markings, they were and basically
police tape, like just around barrels of maple syrup.
There was.
Oh God!
And it's all in French.
Of course, yeah.
They immediately find evidence of a crime. For one, they find the barrels that had been filled with water. And they could tell because those barrels had started to rust. And they knew water rusts, maple syrup doesn't. Some of the others they could tell because they had used regular forklifts instead of the special non-bruising forklifts. And there had been literally black marks from the metal prong of the forklift that had been left on the barrels. They now know that there's a crime.
Can I just say, as intricate and detailed as this sounds, it also kind of sounds like sloppily put together that they kind of made these mistakes. Like, why wouldn't everything be water? Why, you know what I mean? I wish they would have thought some of this stuff through a little more.
Oh, just wait. So they don't have any leads initially. And then when they discover that they were moved by forklift, they go to all the forklift rental places in town and see who rents forklifts. And Avik Karan had rented a forklift in his own name. And it was the special kind of forklift.
You gotta cover your tracks better.
It's at this point where they're telling each other on their own phones to throw out the burner phones.
Doesn't that defeat the purpose of a burner phone? Like, don't talk about your burner phone on traceable phones. Like, what?
After that, obviously, once they have the name, the police start investigating. They get call logs. They see a bunch of contact between Karan, Joitra, and Valier. Joitra he gets interviewed by the police, and he's the one that basically spills the beans.
Or spills the maple syrup.
And he basically details the whole plan. He tells police that he's the one that connects Valier to Karan, and he was the one that would transport the syrup from Karan to Valier in trucks. Valier would then redistribute the syrup to various sellers. One of them was a New Brunswick-based, the province, not the town of New Jersey, syrup reseller, Etienne St-Pierre. And he was the one that basically then sold it and sent it out all over the world. It's not until the end of 2012 that they start making arrests. And that's when Valier and Karan and St-Pierre are all arrested. It takes about 5 years for them to go to trial.
Why does it take so long?
They were building the case.
This is just out of my own curiosity. Does the legal system in Canada move slower than the US, or this was just this specific case took this long?
So they had arrested about 27 people in relation to this syrup syndicate. And the truck driver, Sebastian, he's the one who basically turns, well, in this case, it would be province's evidence, I guess. He testifies for the prosecution. When they finally go to trial, the main players are convicted. So Avik Karan gets 5 years in jail, and he's fined $1.2 million. In fact, he is so angered by this that he basically tells the judge to go fuck himself and gets into it with one of the bailiffs.
Like physically?
Like physically. They threw.
Oh, God.
When Karan gets sentenced, it's not just the actual theft that gets him in trouble. It is what happens once they have the syrup. So they also get dinged for not keeping the syrup in a healthy and safe condition or conditions. In fact, the judge even says in his decision, some accomplices fell sick after tasting the stolen syrup. And then Caron, who was also claimed to be part of the Montreal Italian Mafia, he claimed they were involved and supposedly or allegedly threatened his other co-conspirators in order to keep it going. Valliere allegedly testified that Caron told him if he didn't keep going, he would put a bullet in his head.
Oh, God.
So the three main players come into this in very different ways. Valliere is kind of a freedom fighter. He sees himself as Robin Hood, kind of stealing from the rich to give to the poor, I guess, unsyruped crepes, waffles, and pancakes of the world. Caron is just a bad dude. He was actually in concurrent trials while he was being tried for this. He was also being tried for insurance fraud in another court.
Because of course he was. These guys don't know how to not get caught.
No. Caron, he gets, between the insurance fraud and the maple syrup, he gets about 3.5 years in jail. Valliere gets about 8 years in jail, and he's forced to pay $9.1 million Canadian in fines for theft and conspiracy to commit theft of maple syrup.
Holy shit. Almost $10 million.
Yeah, and then said, oh, by the way, you have 10 years to pay it back. So, and this is the wild part. Valliere appeals the fine, and the appeals court actually reduces the fine to $1 million. This is where, again, the Supreme Court of Canada comes in and says, actually, the appeal court has no authority to do that. The fine is back at $9.1 million. Start paying.
So the appeals court doesn't have the authority to
reduce the fine.
Isn't that their whole purpose, is to appeal a conviction?
Pretty much. Well, he wasn't appealing the conviction as much as he was appealing the fine.
Well, yeah. Okay, well, what stipulations of the conviction or their sentence, whatever.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
This is wild. Now, the sad part in all this is that most of the syrup is never recovered, and
that's the sad part.
We slowly pour one out, and that the syrup that is recovered, they recovered about 3,000 barrels of it, but by the time it's recovered, it's no longer safe for consumption. And so we play taps for the syrup that was lost. And again, and how the Netflix documentary kind of portrays this is that it was yet kind of another story in this very fierce battle between the pro-Federation farmers and the anti-Federation farmers. You have anti-Federation farmers who claim that the Federation makes their lives hell. They surveil them. They basically strong-arm them. You know, the pro-Federation farmer that they interviewed says that anti-Federation farmer set his house on fire 3 times. It gets so in-depth that they interview a gentleman called Hans Mercier, who is and I swear to God this is true, this is my life goal, a maple syrup lawyer. He has made his whole practice maple syrup and representing anti-Federation farmers trying to fight the Federation of Maple Syrup Producers in Quebec.
Somebody's going to do it.
Listen, some of us go to law school to make a difference, whether that's criminal law, civil law, or maple syrup law.
I bet he never thought that this is what he would be doing.
He basically says no. He basically says, I never... I don't think a lot of people who go to law school dream of being maple syrup lawyers and to have it be their life's work. But it kind of also just shows you how out of control this has kind of become on either side, where you have kind of passionate people who are willing to do unspeakable things for their beliefs. By the way, too, two things. So first, it is, until 2023, the biggest heist in Canadian history in terms of money. $18 million. Like, when you think about, I think the biggest heist in this day in American history is still the Lufthansa heist, which I think that was the Henry Hill That was the one that was portrayed in Goodfellas, the Lufthansa heist at JFK Airport in New York. This was the biggest heist in Canadian history until a heist at Toronto Pearson International Airport in 2023. So now it's number 2.
What were they trying to steal? Just money?
Money. They keep money at the airport.
I was going to say, why are all these airports involved?
Think about all the different currency they have to change.
Yeah, that makes sense. I never even thought about that.
I do not know if there have been any heists since, or any great heists since the Great Maple Syrup caper. But I will tell you that when you going through some of the news stories of this, the clip art they show is fantastic. Like the pictures they use for these stories are just random bottles of maple syrup and cans of maple syrup. It's one of those things that's too absurd to even be true, but yet it is.
It sounds absurd.
And it's funny, when they interview one of the anti-Federation farmers for the Netflix piece, they talk about, we're not talking about drugs here. We're not talking about medication. We're talking about maple syrup. But then again, when a lot of people's livelihoods depend on it, and when a lot of people have a lot of money at stake in it, and I mean, as far as I'm aware of, Canada is the only country where the Prime Minister travels around the world with a thing of maple syrup with him.
And listen, I like maple syrup. I do, very much so. But this just seems just beyond ridiculous.
So are you telling me you wouldn't steal 9,600 barrels of maple syrup?
No. Again, I know it probably means something different to Canadians because they seem to love it so much. But like you said, and I said earlier, it's not drugs, it's not firearms, it's not diamonds. Like, it's just really surprising that something like this happened and there's such severe fines for stealing maple syrup.
Now, again, in the documentary that really kind of pushes this narrative of you either pro-federation or anti-federation, the rebels, so to speak, try to push the narrative of, oh, well, you see, they increased the fines because the Federation got to the Supreme Court too, and that's how powerful they are, and they're desperate to maintain their control and maintain their grip on maple syrup. I don't necessarily even think it goes that far. I think, and this might even be more bizarre, you can tell me what you think, Laura. It almost kind of feels like the judges did this as almost to make an example of them, to say, do not try and steal maple syrup again.
I mean, I see that, and that could very well be a possibility. But you kind of alluded to in the beginning that there was some political corruption with this, no?
I think there is. I think the Federation is at least in Quebec, is extremely powerful. And they do have a lot of sway, especially considering they very much control, if not all the maple syrup, a pretty damn big majority of it. It kind of there's a lot of underlying geopolitical things to get into as well, in terms of how the rest of the federal government in Canada will sometimes kind of go out of its way to keep Quebec happy. I do think that plays a part of it. And like I said, I don't doubt the fact that the Federation is powerful. They control all the maple syrup.
I think it also speaks to a broader issue that I don't think is at all isolated just to Canada, but even early 2000s, as we've covered in some of our episodes, like corporate corruption and screwing over the little guy. So this kind of feels very similar to that in a way, where you have this huge monopolistic like machine, and then there's people who just kind of want to do it on their own or sell it on their own or make their own money or whatever it is. And to have this much control over it is just crazy. So I fully understand why people would push back on this and try to get around it and all that stuff.
You mentioned the anti-corporate pushback in the early 2000s. There was also very much kind of a pushback on big government in the early 2000s too. The early 2000s, you're talking about, there was like a big rise or not a big rise, but you started getting more people into like libertarianism. things and talking about limited government and completely free markets. And even Hans Mercier admits when the Federation was formed almost 60 years ago, the intentions were good. The intentions were to basically stabilize prices, to set prices so that you didn't have the effects of a free market basically completely ravaging the smaller producers. The argument was it's a way for everyone to compete.
This was a way for everybody to compete? How?
Well, basically by not having anyone, supposedly not having anyone lose. You wouldn't go bankrupt trying to make maple syrup.
Well, again, just for my own curiosity, is Canada capitalistic? Or they're more socialistic, right?
I mean, they're socialistic in
like healthcare and shit like that.
But it is still a capitalist society.
But then wouldn't I don't know if they have antitrust laws in Canada like we do. You know what I mean?
I know they do when it comes to things like telecom. Because, for example, there are two massive telecom behemoths. They have their hands in everything. And when they go into a new market or when they buy stations, they actually have to divest stations or properties in that market before they can make another acquisition.
So it's fine to control this for the telecom industry, but not for the maple syrup industry?
Basically, it's a land of contrasts.
I don't know. I'm just struggling with understanding why they thought this was a good idea and why they thought this would promote fairness in any way, because it doesn't.
And that's the point that Hans makes, is that they may have started out with the best of intentions to not have anyone be a quote unquote victim of the free market. But what he also points out is that
I was just gonna say, but you're eliminating the free market though, so there's nothing.
Well, that's what he even says, is that eventually these types of controlled, I don't know. I don't think socialistic is the right word, but these kind of controlled, capped economies, eventually they all fail to an extent.
It's just, that's so crazy. Has the sentiment changed at all since this, or even recently, where there's any thought or consideration to maybe changing this, or maybe enough pushback and resistance still from, regular people to try to want to change this?
There were two producers in Quebec who had their entire maple syrup production seized by the provincial police because they refused to deal with the Federation. I mean, again, they seized trees in somebody's backyard because they wouldn't deal with the Federation.
That raises questions for me. Is there some kind of eminent domain laws like we have, down by the southern border? Do you know what I mean? It sounds so complicated that they pulled this off to begin with.
We're one step away from where does it begin when it's boiled, or does it begin when it's yoinked out of the trees in a faucet?
I would just think if this happened in America, the backlash to this would be unreal. And that. I think you would agree.
I would. I mean, I also think there would also be extremely powerful you wouldn't have a government federation like this.
Yes.
It'd be a multinational corporation behind it, and basically they would have just paid the fine. Then 2 years later, some politician would have written a law that said they can do this. And oh, by the way, they also have veto power in the Senate.
Now that sounds like the American way. Yes, agreed. But you have to agree, too, that this impedes on the rights of these Canadian residents.
Again, life is very good if you're a pro-Federation farmer. The pro-Federation farmer they interview, also has history. His grandfather was one of the founders of the Federation, or I think it was either the founders or one of the first presidents. So, I mean, literally the official designation on Wikipedia for this is a cartel. That should kind of tell you all you need to know about. And listen, I'm not going to sit here and make judgments on whether or not it's a good or a bad thing. I think there's a lot of politics at play here that people who don't live in Canada or just don't live outside Quebec that aren't really, don't really know.
I was going to say, I had no idea that this was a thing. And I guarantee you that 98% of Americans have no idea that this is a thing.
Well, no, because I think we also think that most of the maple syrup comes from Vermont anyway. I think like with everything else, I think there's a growing polarization. You're either on one side or you're on the other without anything in the middle. When I was researching this, I didn't really find anything that they make any sort of political donations or lean one way or the other. Because I just don't think it matters. I think it's kind of pretty much been shown that whoever's in power, whether it's the Liberals or the Conservatives or there's like 20 parties in Canada, they all kind of defer to them. And I think like with anything else now, you have people that are very loyal to it because the system is good for them. They're making enough money where they don't mind kind of kicking back a portion of their proceeds as almost like membership dues, essentially. And there are a lot of people who feel very strongly otherwise, and they've mobilized. The anti-Federation farmer that was interviewed, held multiple protests over to basically reduce the Federation's role, impact, or to basically get rid of the Federation altogether. When a Federation officer went to go and inspect a farm, you had people literally waiting outside for him to stop him from going to inspect the farm. It really is, and this is so silly to say out loud, but it's kind of a writ large version of so many other issues that we see on a daily basis. Because you can't deny that people are passionate about this and that this is something that they've kind of dedicated their lives to.
I know you said you didn't want to pass judgment on this either way, but I know for me, I would definitely be on the anti-Federation side, for sure. What side would you be on?
I don't see how the Federation existing helps people. I think there's a very specific and a very direct line between organization that controls a certain commodity and, almost overarching force that basically claims ownership of a product and ownership of a land that isn't even theirs. It's one thing to say we're going to control prices. We're going to make sure that we're going to try to keep all these producers in business. That's one thing. It's another to say you can only produce so much. You have to give the rest to us. You have to give us a cut of the profit. And oh, by the way, you can't do anything with this syrup without going through us. Like that's something completely different. And that's where I think there's a great question about whether it really starts to invade people's, not privacy, obviously, but like personal freedoms. Although I guess privacy in a way.
Yeah, because you're going onto their property, which they own. Like that's, it bothers me.
Like I said, there's a lot of complicated issues that we see on a daily basis that really have been concentrated, like maple syrup, into this issue.
Yeah, it's crazy. I can't believe they're getting away with doing this, but, I guess I get it to some degree. It just seems very contradictory to what they think that they're doing.
Yeah. And like I said, the lawyer said, they started out with, I think, good intention, but it's as the money started rolling in, unfortunately, I think money corrupts all.
Well, yeah.
I think once it became evident how much money could be made, I think you had a federation that really kind of corrupted its purpose.
That's another question. What does the Federation do with this money? Does it go back to the government? Like, what happens with it?
It's a private entity, so basically they just keep it for themselves.
Oh, great. So this isn't even going to benefit anybody. So it essentially is
a monopoly.
It is, and it's corrupt as shit. that it like you said, it's a private entity, but also kind of government backed on multiple levels. Like, that's insane. Again, this would never, well, I'm sure that it does. I know that it does. I can't think of an example, but I was going to say this, I guess this wouldn't happen as quietly in America, but
Again, you have a federation that I think corrupted its purpose. And because of it now, it's gone from something that may have started out well-intentioned to help farmers, but now really just helps itself and helps the powers that be. And so what you have instead is people who have a vested interest in protecting their way of life.
well, yeah, after they're making all this money, they're not going to change this and they're going to fight like hell to make sure that it isn't changed.
And then on the other side, you have a lot of people who are going to fight like hell to protect their freedoms. There's no easy answer to this. Again, it's not something you would think is a complex issue, but it's an incredibly complex issue. So tell us what you guys think, and we want to know, especially if you live in Quebec. If you live in Quebec and you have any insights on the maple syrup industry, we definitely want to hear from you. You can email us at tellmeaboutpodcast@gmail.com. You can reach us on Instagram or on TikTok, as long as we can do TikTok, at the Tell Me About Podcast.
Shout out to our Canadian listeners, though. We appreciate you guys, and we think this is bullshit.
Just a little note about the schedule. So March 20th is when you're going to be hearing this. We're going to have 2 episodes coming out, one on the 27th and one on April 3rd. That's going to be the inaugural film festival, the inaugural entry into the Tell Me About Podcast Film Festival.
It's a part 1 and a part 2.
Which kind of is a spoiler as to what the first movie is. So we'll just tell you right now, it's a movie I've never seen before.
I still cannot believe that you have never seen this.
Yeah, I can see that.
This series of movies were so popular back in the 90s. Like, I don't know how you missed this. These are iconic.
So what is she talking about? Is she talking about Terminator? Is she talking about Indiana Jones? Is she talking about Weekend at Bernie's? Is she talking about The Fast and the Furious? We will find out over the next 2 weeks. And also, by the way, too, starting in April, we're going to be going every other week in April through the early part of May. So we will keep you guys updated as to when episodes are coming out so that you guys don't miss a beat. You know, we love you. We thank you for hanging with us, and we want you to join us as we continue down this road and this family that we're building here.
So we will see you next week with the first episode from the film festival.
All right. Have a great week, everyone.
Bye.